There truly are no words for how excited I am to present today's episode to you. From the moment that the book Opus, The Cult of Dark Money, Human Trafficking, and Right-Wing Conspiracy Inside the Catholic Church was announced, I have followed the subsequent press closely. And the moment that the book was available for pre-order, I placed my order, and the moment that I got the book in my hands, I couldn't put it down. The importance of Opus and what it represents cannot be overstated. This is how the story began. When Banco Popular suddenly collapsed in the early hours of June 7th, 2017, attention naturally turned to those caught up in what turned out to be one of the largest bank failures ever seen in Europe. Spanish television broadcast scenes of angry customers outside shuttered branches all over the country, brandishing placards, demanding answers, and prison for those responsible. Reporters interviewed tearful pensioners who had lost everything in the collapse, elderly men and women who had entrusted their life savings to a bank once hailed as one of the strongest and most profitable in the world. The financial press pursued another angle, focusing on supposedly savvy bond investors like PIMCO and Anchorage Capital, who had lost hundreds of millions of dollars overnight. Around the world, everyone was asking the same question. How could a well-known Spanish lender, an institution with a proud 90-year history, which owned another bank in the United States and had offices as far afield as Shanghai, Dubai, and Rio de Janeiro, just disappear overnight? But amid all of the coverage, no mention was made of the biggest casualty of all. For more than 60 years, a shadowy group of men sworn to a life of celibacy and self-flagellation had secretly controlled the bank and taken advantage of their positions there to siphon off billions of dollars. This is the previously untold story of how these men hijacked Banco Popular and transformed it into a cash machine for Opus Dei, the controversial religious sect they belonged to, transforming this tiny, secretive religious movement into one of the most powerful forces in the Catholic Church, bankrolling the creation of a vast recruitment network targeting children and vulnerable teenagers, and creating a beachhead in the world of U.S. politics that would make Opus Dei a secret but critical force behind the recent erosion of reproductive rights and other civil liberties. In a world obsessed with conspiracy theories of QAnon and Bilderberg, this is a real-life story of abuse, manipulation, and greed cloaked in the mantle of holiness. The Financial Times published an article reviewing the book, and they wrote that in 2003, a diligent member of Opus Dei's PR team spotted an item in Publishers Weekly about a forthcoming novel entitled The Da Vinci Code. After tracking down an advanced copy, he discovered to his horror that it featured a self-flagellating albino assassin used by the Catholic organization to murder its opponents. The alarmed pressman took the matter to his Opus Dei boss, who, after some consideration, calmly reassured him that Dan Brown's novel sounded so silly that nobody will ever buy it. For many years, the ultra-conservative Catholic organization that emerged in Franco's Spain was often regarded as a cartoonish sect, with insufficient mainstream attention paid to the testimony of ex-members and victims alleging decades of financial control, coercion, and sexual abuse. Gareth Gore's vividly told and excellently researched book Opus is part of a more recent journalistic reconsideration of the accountability of a group that began as the dream of a young Spanish priest and grew into an international network able to mold not only the agenda of the Catholic Church, but exert its influence over one of Spain's largest banks and even the U.S. Supreme Court. This book holds up to scrutiny. Not the type of scrutiny that Opus Dei uses, which looks a whole lot more like obfuscation, in my opinion, but true critical review. This book is not an attack on the Catholic Church, but rather the pointed expose of a corrupt and dangerous force using the Catholic Church as a cloak to obscure its true intentions. An article published on U.S. Catholic identified the book as, quote, a much-needed expose of financial scandals, political manipulation, and coercion in Opus Dei's powerful international networks. Those who have nothing to hide have nothing to fear. So I think Opus Dei's response to the book, which has been denial, is very telling. This book is extremely important and will be the topic of conversations for, I predict, years to come. But it wouldn't exist at all without the man who put in the time and effort to write it. That man is Gareth Gore, and he is the reason for today's episode. Ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to present my conversation with Gareth Gore about his new book, Opus. Let's not waste another moment and get right into it. My name is Rebecca. Welcome to the Deep Dive Project. Welcome, Gareth Gore, to the Deep Dive project. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
I am so excited to talk to you today. I read your book. I think it'd probably actually be more correct to say I devoured your book. I could not put it down. Opus, The Cult of Dark Money, Human Trafficking, and Right-Wing Conspiracy Inside the Catholic Church. And it was amazing. I have so many thoughts, but I have no notes. It was just an impeccably well researched piece of work. And for anyone who might not know of you or have read the book yet and know your background in writing it, would you take me through what compelled you to tell this story?
Oh, I mean, I never set out to write anything about Opus Dei. I wasn't interested in Opus Dei in any way, but I just kind of fell into this by accident. So I'm a financial reporter by background, and I was asked to report on a bank in Spain which had collapsed.
Mhm.
Um, and at first, it just seemed like the same old story of the managers had taken on too many risks, allowed things to spiral out of control. And initially, that's the way I kind of wrote about the story. But through sheer kind of chance and serendipity, I found myself back in Spain 2 years later and decided to just kind of look in at the story again. And I began to make contact with some of the key players. And I basically uncovered this completely unexpected story. And I fell down this Opus Dei rabbit hole, which I think you've also found yourself inside
Yes.
of at times as well. And which and like um as a journalist, you you dream of these kinds of stories kind of falling into your lap. And I have to say that, you know, I've been extremely fortunate in just accidentally falling, upon this story. And obviously I've done a lot of work to try to unpick it and get to the bottom of things. But yeah, I mean, chance has played a pretty big part of it as well.
Hmm. Yeah, I relate very much to the Opus Dei rabbit hole. I don't think anyone really intends to fall down the Opus Dei rabbit hole. It's something that I think kind of just happens to you. And it's a never ending one at that. I've not found the light at the end of the tunnel yet, but you detail getting so much of the story about Banco Popular from Javier Valls Taberner. And I would love to know kind of like inside your own head what it was like for you hearing all of this for the first time. And in addition to that, what has the experience been like for you overall, uncovering all of this information and everything that it implicates? Like, I imagine it must have at times felt like your head was just going to explode.
Yeah, so Javier, I met him in Madrid in in kind of the spring of 2019. It was kind of a strange time for me because my mother had just died like a few days before this, and we'd kind of just arranged this meeting, and I'd been researching Banco Popular and the kind of backstory, the history. I knew about the two Valls Taberner brothers. So for the people that don't know about them, there's the older brother called Luis, who was a numerary member of Opus Dei. So basically, he lived this life of celibacy, poverty, and obedience to the movement. And he'd been part of Opus Dei since he was a teenager, which is quite common. We can talk about that a little bit more in a while, the way that children and teenagers are kind of reeled into the movement. So there's the older brother Luis, and then the younger brother Javier, who was completely different. He was not a member of Opus Dei. He was very much kind of known as a kind of a bon vivant. He's a guy who loved a good party, and he enjoyed his golf, went out in all of Madrid's best restaurants and enjoyed a glass of wine and stuff. In fact, I had a glass of wine with him at his
Mm-hmm.
home in Switzerland when I went to visit him. And he, the two guys but they were quite complimentary in the bank. Lewis was the serious guy. He did all kind of boring day-to-day management, whereas Javier would be out on the golf course schmoozing with the clients. They made a good team. They were known inside the bank as Opus Dei and Opus Night, kind of rather comically. And so yeah, I remember so the reason I met Javier was because so I've been researching the story of the bank, and I was intrigued by Luis, the member of Opus Dei, the older brother, and I found this book written by his nephew, so the son of Javier, and I read this book, devoured this book, and reached out to the nephew and said, "Hey, I'd love to talk to you." And I met him for coffee, and he was like, my dad's still alive, right? I can set you up with a meeting with my dad if you like. And I was like, wow, that would be amazing, to actually be able to speak to someone and piece together how this bank collapsed and the connections with Opus Dei. And so he arranged for me to go meet his dad. And yeah, my first impressions of Javier were it's kind of funny because I by this stage he was well into his 80s,
Mm-hmm.
turned up at his house, knocked on the door, and the maid kind of answered the door. And I was like, I'm here to see Javier. We've kind of booked I've booked a kind of a meeting with him. And she was like, kind of looking around. She was like, okay, come through to the living room. And she kind of went off and scuttled off. He was clearly having a siesta. And so he was like roused from his sleep and kind of, staggered into the living room, like still half asleep. This kind of English journalist had just come to meet him. But we really hit it off. And okay, what did I make of it? I mean, like we spent when he finally woke up, we spent like I think 3 hours talking on that first day. And I remember getting the train back home that night, after talking to him for 3 hours. I had pages and pages and pages of notes. Luckily, I'd recorded the conversation as well, which gave me something to listen back to. But my head was just spinning with ideas of directions that I could go in. And, that was the start of it. Up until that point, I'd been focused, I think, on just telling the story of the rise and fall of the bank. But then it became clear to me that there was this whole Opus Dei connection. And so, yeah, that was the start of what became a much wider story.
Mm-hmm. So was that kind of the moment when you knew that you were sitting on something that was bigger than just some bank that went bust?
Yeah, no, I think it was. And like I was saying before, every journalist dreams of kind of just stumbling upon one of these stories. And I think for me, that was the moment when I thought, you know what, this has the potential to be an absolutely amazing story. And so it just set me off, researching this and going in all kinds of directions. I know to be in the beginning, I wasn't really clear what to do with it. I toyed with the idea of just writing a long feature and maybe pitching something to the New Yorker. In fact, I did pitch something to the New Yorker, and they were initially a bit interested, but then kind of went off the idea.
Oh,
But just carried on researching, and it eventually became a book proposal. So yeah.
I mean, it is an amazing story. It's an incredible story. I think that for anyone who's encountering the information for the first time, it can feel in many ways very fantastic. But I think that to the book's credit, and this is to your credit as a researcher, the entire narrative is set up and executed in such a way that the reader learns as they're going through the book all of this complex information in a way that is very organic to me. Reading the book, it felt very organic. And one of the things that I really appreciated was all of the background that you provided on Jose Maria Escriva, the founder of Opus Dei. There were some things in the book that I didn't know about him, just details about what his childhood was like growing up, the background that he came out of. This isn't giving away anything in the book really for anyone who hasn't read it yet, because it's relatively common knowledge, I guess, if you were to look into his life. But his parents lost everything and were basically destitute. And the impact that that must have had on a child's psyche, developmentally speaking, I'm sure is huge. But one of the things about that story, about the perspective that you gave of Escriva that really stood out to me when I read it was his excessive use of corporal mortification. And I want to just read a snippet very quickly, if you don't mind. You wrote, quote, he used the discipline, which is the rope whip, 3 times a week, with an additional lashing once every 2 weeks and also on feast days. He also used the cilice, a small spiked chain worn around the thigh, multiple times a day, twice before lunch and then in the afternoon. On Tuesdays, he used a cilice that wrapped around his waist. On Saturdays, he fasted, although he would often find any excuse to deny himself food or water. At his mother's house, he would turn on the faucets to muffle the cracks of the whip and carefully clean up afterwards, but she would still find specks of blood on the floor and the walls. I'm interested in hearing your perspective of this behavior. And do you think that it indicates anything significant about Jose Maria Escriva? Because from my perspective, this is the behavior of a deeply troubled individual.
I mean, the simple answer to that is I don't know. I mean, and no one will ever know because,
Of
but
course.
I think what I tried to do with the book is Opus Dei has already put out so many hagiographies about Jose Maria Escrivá over the years. There have been so many books written about his life. There's, the big one, the 3 volume one that was written a number of years ago, but there are many of them, almost all of them written by either Opus Dei priests or Opus Dei numeraries, who, you know, have been granted pretty extensive access to the Opus Dei archives, which unfortunately wasn't granted to me. I did ask, but I was turned down. They did provide me with a small number of things, but very very little. But what I tried to do was, I devoured all of those kind of official biographies of Escrivá. And what I tried to do was, I tried to kind of read them with a critical eye of trying to pick out details that were often just glossed over in the hagiographies, and or were framed in a certain way, and tried to kind of ask questions about them. And one of them, as you quite rightly pick up, is this idea of corporal mortification. So it's framed in the hagiographies as being quite a as being a kind of, I guess, an indication of his, it's an element of his spirituality. It's an indication of his devotion to God, and the way, it's a way for him to feel connected to God and to offer up his pain to God. And I accept that that's one way of viewing things.
Yeah.
But I do feel that there is also another element to this, which he would turn to corporal mortification quite frequently at times of personal crisis. And even in his writings, you sense a deep kind of, maybe unhappiness is the wrong word, but he's struggling with certain things. One of which is the fact that he really fails to recruit hardly anyone to Opus Dei in the first few years after supposedly receiving this vision from God. And so I'm sure that causes, a certain amount of personal frustration and anguish, and a sense that he's failing God. But he also has all, various other issues that he's struggling to deal with, including his weight. He's clearly, he struggles with food. He calls himself kind of gluttonous, and he frequently overeats and puts on weight, and then he's unhappy with himself because of what he's done. And even in those instances, corporal mortification is a way of, I think, dealing with those issues. And but I think certainly through a modern kind of lens, it's perhaps not the most healthy way of dealing with some of those elements. So I think, yes, I mean, we will never know what was going on inside of his head, but I think the tendency in the hagiographies to basically frame corporal mortification as just a way of connecting with God and feeling closer to the suffering of Christ, I think um, is insufficient. And what I try to do is kind of build additional layers on that and ask these questions because I think they're important questions.
Mhm.
This is a guy who is drawing up an extremely detailed blueprint for that will control people's lives. The Numeri members will live a life that's um, determined by, almost minute by minute by
Yes.
what Escrivá believes is the right way to lead their lives. And so, so I think it's essential to try to kind of delve into his psychology and personality to try to understand what was driving some of those decisions.
Hmm.
And, this question of corporal mortification is effectively a requirement for Numeries. People are
Yes.
expected to perform the same rituals that Escrivá was performing on himself. And so I think it's quite valid to ask why he was doing that to himself and whether um yeah and what the read through then is for the people that are being expected to do the same thing.
Precisely. And that leads right into like the next point and question that I was going to ask, because this has been said many different ways by many different people, including in your book, but it's really eerie to see the extent to which Escriva's coping mechanisms. And I understand there was a spiritual element at play, but I think, religion can mask many things. And I think sometimes, unfortunately, it can mask mental illness. And that's just my opinion, and my take on the situation. But it's eerie to see the extent to which those things that he did and the obsessions that he had became baked into Opus Dei's organizational character. And I think that members' use of the Silas and discipline are perfect examples of that playing out in real time. And from my point of view, I think Escriva was a deeply flawed human being with some serious mental health problems. And it seems like many of the symptoms of those problems are still manifest in Opus Dei today. And that is one of the reasons why I continue to point out the inconsistencies and the issues that I see within the organization, because I understand they can't acknowledge the problems because Escriva to them he's a saint and he's the founder of their organization. He's the father. But you have to, because if you don't, innocent people are going to continue to get hurt.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I think yes, the founder of Opus Dei, Escrivá, is absolutely a flawed character. Quite possibly has, you know, mental health issues around his weight, and all kinds of stuff. But then for he develops these coping mechanisms, which, include, his devotion to God, but also the corporal mortification. But then for him to then, as you quite rightly say, and very quite eloquently say as well, for him to then bake those coping mechanisms into the very structure of Opus Dei and make these coping mechanisms a requirement for his followers, raises quite serious issues. And I think Opus Dei, in many ways, these ideas were baked into Opus Dei 100 years ago.
Yes.
So he had this vision. He then wrote down in meticulous detail what this vision was and how the organization should be structured, how people should lead their lives. And and so Opus Dei has now got itself into a corner effectively because it's impossible to challenge any of this minutiae of how the organization works or how numeraries or supernumeraries should lead their lives without challenging the entire foundations upon which Opus Dei is built. So to challenge any of these rules is to challenge the foundational documents, which is to challenge the vision itself, because Escrivá himself, he said that, God showed me what Opus Dei was like in its entirety. So his writings, if you take that logic to its end, like his writings reflect what God wants for Opus Dei. So it's impossible to then change anything. And so I think Opus Dei is now in a bind. So they've got all of these elements of the organization, like the grooming of children, the Numeri assistant problem, and the slavery, human trafficking, and the control and manipulation of the Numeri members and the supernumeraries as well. It can't. I'm sure. I'm certain that there's an awareness within the organization that many of these elements of life within Opus Dei are unacceptable in the 21st century and need to be changed. But they can't do that without opening up a can of worms, without destabilizing the foundations upon which the entire organization is built. I mean, I remember speaking to someone quite senior when I was at the Opus Dei headquarters in Rome, on the women's branch, and she said to me, my life would be so much easier if the Numeri assistant vacations, so these kind of maids, effectively, if this didn't exist. But there's from Embracing a Person, a recognition that perhaps, this is not this doesn't look good, and we should probably do away with it, but we can't. We're kind of trapped. And so, yeah, I think, it's an interesting dynamic, I think.
I've observed and made note of the exact same things many, many times, particularly about Opus Dei painting themselves into this corner. Like you said, I mean, I don't even know how you begin to get yourself out of a situation like this. And I think that probably, speculating here, of course, but I think that may be a big part of the reason why their response to your book and the situation playing out in Argentina right now and everything else have been kind of strange. I think it's just because they realize there's nothing for them to say. If they try to authentically engage with the material in your book, they'll have to acknowledge a host of things that they are simply unprepared to acknowledge. And so I think that is a big part of the problem. And I have no idea. I don't know how you begin to correct that.
Yeah, and in many ways, I was quite disappointed in the response to my book, from Opus Dei, I should say. The response from very much from former members has been really amazing. But and we can talk about that again, a little bit later if you like. But
Yes.
but I was hoping, perhaps naively, I was hoping that the book might give Opus Dei some space to take on to not necessarily um admit wrongdoing and whatever, but at least give Opus Dei some space to admit that things weren't perfect, and give them some space to reform. So we all know that allegations come up against individuals, against companies, organizations all the time. And the response from any reasonable organization or company is always, when an allegation surfaces, is to say, we're going to take this absolutely seriously. We're going to launch an investigation. And, if the investigation reveals that this is true or reveals any kinds of problems, that we commit to doing something about it. Opus Dei response to my book is that it's all lies. There's no truth to this. Which is just like, guys, I'm giving, this is a chance for you to sort your problems out. But I mean, yeah, the response is really quite telling. And like I said, I perhaps naively hoped that they might take this as an opportunity to address some of the issues. And these are issues that, I've spoken to more than 100 current members of Opus Dei, including some of the most senior members. And there's an acknowledgement, up and down the hierarchy, that there are problems inside of Opus Dei, but clearly there's an
Like there's a
unwillingness.
disconnect or something.
Yeah, there's some kind of, I think, on a one-on-one level, people are willing to acknowledge that, yeah, there are some problems, and yeah, maybe things are not ideal. But at an institutional level, there's just this kind of unwillingness, or I don't know, a lack of ability to address these problems. I'm not sure whether that's from the head of Opus Dei himself, or whether it's the kind of governing council, or whether it's these electors, the people that, the kind of city members who vote on change. But yeah, I don't know where it comes from. But yeah, the institution and the individuals within the institution are not on the same page when it
Mm,
comes to whether reforms are necessary or not. And
that's really interesting.
so, in fact, I heard recently from a an Opus Dei priest who's still inside the organization, who reached out to me and thanked me for writing the book and was saying that, all of this is true. And this is a guy that's still inside the organization, but he's hoping that change will happen. But I fear that the only way that change will happen is if change is imposed on Opus Dei. So I think the the one avenue to reform that I see is Pope Francis imposing reform on Opus Dei. But
Hmm.
yeah, I guess we
Hmm.
will see whether that happens or not.
Yes, it's going to be we could get into a whole tangent sidebar about the Vatican and their response to Opus Dei over the years. I did really appreciate all of the detail and background context that you provided in Opus about the relationship between Opus Dei and the Vatican. Because early days back when I was initially beginning all of this, that was one of the things that I looked at first because I'm thinking this organization is so outrageously out of control and is doing all of these things. Like, technically they answer to the Vatican, like they answer to the Pope. So what is going on there? And that relationship, I have a few different theories about why it is the way that it is, but it is really, really interesting. And you have spoken about this in other interviews as well, taking the perspective that Pope Francis has to be very careful in how he handles Opus Dei because of the complicated nature of that relationship. Would you care to extrapolate on that just a little bit for us today? Anyone listening?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean the church has to absolutely take responsibility for many of these issues as well. I mean, first of all, Pope John Paul II granted Opus Dei unprecedented power to expand basically unchecked anywhere it wanted to in the world outside of the normal hierarchy of the church. So that whenever abuses or concerns arose in, archdioceses around the world, it was impossible for the local archbishop to do anything about them because Opus Dei basically operated outside of the normal checks and balances system,
Mm-hmm.
um, church hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
And John Paul II had, created that mechanism for Opus Dei to escape accountability and for it to expand in a completely unaccountable way. But even Pope Benedict as well, he he had his misgivings about Opus Dei being given these special powers. He also was very much aware of the abuses that were taking place within Opus Dei, especially the way that Opus Dei was using kind of these enforced examinations of conscience, the chat, to basically, extract information from members and to kind of to manipulate members to a certain extent. And he kind of semi forced them to change that, but he could have gone much further because I'm convinced he was aware of great abuses, and Pope Francis as well. I mean, he's been aware of abuses within Opus Dei for many years. So the case in Argentina, which we can talk about in more detail, first surfaced at the Vatican, 3, 4 years ago. He's known about this, but has not really done anything to intervene since then. Around the same time, a large group of former numeraries filed a complaint at the Vatican for alleging all kinds of
Mm-hmm.
uh, psychological, spiritual abuse. So the Vatican's been sitting on these formal complaints for 3, 4 years now and has done nothing. I mean, we've had the motu proprios from the Pope, so he's kind of taken Opus Dei down a peg and kind of put them on warning, but we're yet to see any real intervention. And to get back to your specific question about why that might be, um, I think I think it comes down to power and money, really. I think
Mm-hmm.
and also a concern for the church. So I think Pope Francis doesn't want to create a schism. He knows that Opus Dei has many powerful allies, especially in the US.
Yeah.
Many, you know, the 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 US Catholic Church has um, almost been taken over by conservative forces,
Mm.
partly because of money, but also um, partly because of the number of bishops that John Paul II promoted during his papacy. But like so I think he's quite aware that if he were to take down Opus Dei or if he were to intervene in a very aggressive way, that would that would create a quite a bit of there'll be a reaction
Yes.
let's say, which could be very damaging for the church. And so he's quite conscious of that. But I think, and maybe I'm being too skeptical here, but I think he's also aware of the financial damage that the sexual abuse scandals wreaked on the church. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
in the US, many dioceses and archdioceses have filed for bankruptcy because of the compensation claims that they've faced. Similar situation in other parts of the world. I think there's an acute awareness um, that allowing admitting to these abuses and potentially opening Opus Dei and the wider church up to huge compensation claims from thousands and thousands of former numeraries and numerary assistants could well be, financially crippling, not just for Opus Dei, but for the wider church. And so I think all of those things are in play and at the forefront of Francis's mind. But, he's the head of an organization that's supposed to be promoting Christian values. I would argue that all of those things should be secondary, should be
Yes.
lower than secondary. Like he
Yes.
should be standing up for what is a moral, and spiritual issue here. And I think it's a major failing on his part that he has not yet taken decisive action against this clearly abusive group.
I agree. I agree. And for my part, I was raised Catholic. I was raised by very conservative Catholic people, and my family is still very religious. So growing up, I had experiences interacting with like the traditional Latin mass communities and like the SSPX groups, and I knew of Opus Dei. We were never involved. I don't think I ever knew anyone who was, but I was aware of these organizations and the role that they were kind of playing in providing formation. And at that point in my life, as a young kid being bought into a religious system, that didn't raise any red flags for me. But now, knowing what I know about this organization and also just about the things that have happened in my country to shape the narrative, particularly around religion and politics, um, it's interesting to see the way religion, Catholicism specifically in this country, has changed so drastically since even I was a child. And of course, those changes began to be implemented many, many years before I was born. But I think that Opus Dei plays a part in that, and it may not be a huge part. I think people want to make Opus Dei out to be the ultimate boogie bad man. They want Opus Dei to be responsible for every single problem, and I am certainly willing to hold them responsible for the things that they have done that have been bad. But regardless of the size of their role, the fact that they're here at all, the fact that they are so omnipresent, especially now in politics, and
Mm.
there's this like something weird going on with them in the Vatican, it just all sets off too many red flags. And for my research, I ended up coming back to the same conclusion. It's about the money. Like I read the same thing in an article that I dug up somewhere, and it was literally it in type. It was like, it's the money, stupid. Like it's the money. That is why this relationship is the way that it is, and it explains, I think, a lot of the behavior that the Vatican and the Pope has demonstrated towards these problems, and that's really, really upsetting. I'm sure for Catholics who are following this issue, it must be very, very upsetting. It's the church's track history with handling abuse is not good anyway, so this just really adds to that. But yeah, very interesting. I won't pick away at that too much more because we have other things that I want to talk to you about, but that part of it is really key. Um, Another thing that your book does really well is it does an excellent job of highlighting the extent to which a fascist ideology has played into the formation of Opus Dei. And you wrote, in public, Escrivá was at pains to distance himself from the regime back home and to insist on Opus Dei as an apolitical institution. But in private, he was more than happy to take Franco's money. And one of the criticisms that Opus Dei has received, and one which I myself think has merit, has been that while the organization makes statement after statement affirming that it's apolitical and that it continues, that they're not involved with anything, it continues to benefit from some pretty, in my opinion, blatantly political relationships in the United States and elsewhere. And what are your thoughts on the extent to which fascism has influenced Opus Dei's formation? And because of that, to whatever extent, what do you think can be inferred about Opus Dei by that?
I mean, I think it kind of exposes a kind of contradiction at the heart of the Christian values. I mean,
Yes.
this is so. I think they are Opus Dei is quite clearly willing to turn a blind eye to so they were willing to get into bed with General Franco. This was a guy that was a brutal dictator.
Mm-hmm.
So Franco was murdering tens of thousands of his political opponents during peacetime. We're not talking about during the war here. We're talking about afterwards during peacetime. Um, he was sending his political opponents to the Nazis to be experimented on. So the Nazis were they were obsessed with, this kind of red, they called it the red gene. And they were
Mm-hmm.
trying to find, whether or not people were biologically predispositioned to be liberals and progressives.
Yeah.
And Franco sent over, some of his political opponents to be tested on. This guy was a brute, and Opus Dei was very happy to cozy up to him and to take his money. They were, Escrivá and Del Portillo, who was his kind of second in command for the people that don't know. They were writing letters to the Caudillo to tell him how great he was and how he was on this Christian mission.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I mean, for me, that's the disconnect. So I think Escrivá and the organization in general is obsessed with this idea of re-Christianizing the world, and of spreading, you know, the word, spreading the love of Jesus across. But for them to be, so they want to spread Christianity, but at the same time, they're willing to do it in a deeply unchristian way. It just like for me, I just don't really get that. And there are certain, maybe it's a bit too early to be getting into present day politics, but I see similar
Yes.
things with Trump. I mean, you have Trump surrounded by all of these supposedly devout Christians. Like Trump is, I'm going to choose my words carefully, but Trump does not espouse Christian values, and so I just do not understand how these people can hold their nose and turn the other way and support this guy whose values are clearly at complete odds with the things that the world that they're supposedly trying to build.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um,
in the International Ecclesiastical Institutional Complaint that was filed to the church by Moya Somolinos et al. They say something at the end of that document that I think really explains a lot of Opus Dei's bizarre aligning with questionable people. And they said that the means justify the ends as long as the ends benefit Opus Dei. And Opus Dei has this agenda that they're carrying out, this, ostensibly divine sort of order from Escriva that came down from God. So from their perspective, I have to think that there's this sort of utilitarian type attitude where it's like, well, it really doesn't matter what we have to do to accomplish this because this is the holy mission that we're on. These are our holy marching orders.
Yeah, I think the philosophy these days is just if it's beneficial to Opus Dei as an organization, then anything goes.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we're willing to cozy up to Trump. We're willing to take whoever's money, so long as it's, if it's good for the organization, it helps us to expand and get more members and become more influential, then anything goes.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to point out to people that there's this kind of attitude of like, well, these are all new problems, and we didn't have any of these problems before, I don't know, pick whatever keystone moment in our history. But the fact of the matter is, there have kind of always been these like hiccups and issues and organizations, religious organizations, using some ostensibly, holy order to justify some really terrible things. I mean, if you claim to be operating under orders from God, you can justify almost anything. And I think we see examples of that playing out throughout history. And unfortunately, I feel like Opus Dei is another example of that.
Yeah, and it's also it's a kind of vicious cycle as well because um I mean, I'm reminded of Escrivá giving a 6-day private retreat for Franco and his wife,
I
and you're
didn't
kind
know
of
that. And when I read that in your book, that blew my mind. Like I always knew, I was like, there has to be some type of connection between the government and Opus Dei at that time. Like it's so clear that there was with the cabinet members and everything else. I did not know about that private retreat. And that really just like blew my mind. I was like, that's the only like that proves the point.
yeah. I mean, oh, to be a fly on the wall in you know in that house for those 6 days, but we can even fast forward to today and somewhere like the Catholic Information Center in Washington, which for your listeners and viewers that don't know is the Opus Dei chapel and bookshop, the Opus Dei hub,
Mm-hmm.
basically in central Washington. So you have all of these, you know, reactionary conservative, these radical conservatives, out making policy about rounding up immigrants and the rest of it. And then they're going for mass in confession at the CIC, and where presumably the priests are telling them, you're doing God's work. This is good. It's kind of this kind of Opus Dei, I think, in many ways provides some of these figures with almost a kind of a spiritual justification for what they're doing, and which is quite frequently at odds with the kinds of policies and changes that Pope Francis, who is himself a flawed figure, but it's not like they're pushing Catholic doctrine that they
Exactly.
are. It's a very I think Opus Dei has become, especially in places like the US, but not just the US, in other countries too, has has kind of carved out this position for itself as, well, we're going to provide like the spiritual justification and the spiritual pat on the back for these, these people who are
It's like
carrying
an
out,
extra little safeguard.
yes, yes,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, for these people who are carrying out deeply unchristian policies and changes.
Mm-hmm. In highlighting all of that sort of financial chicanery, we'll refer to it as, with Banco Popular and also the money that they accepted from the Franco government. You also exposed one of, if not the darkest elements in how the organization supported its expansion, what is in effect slave labor and human trafficking. And I am, of course, referring to Opus Dei's servant class, the assistant numeraries. And in Opus, you wrote the numerary servants were uneducated women from poor backgrounds. Escriva saw this new underclass as vital to creating a more rarefied atmosphere within the residences, making the numerary members feel even more special. So, from my perspective, the numerary assistant, the mere fact that there is this servant class in Opus Dei reveals how calculated and analytical Escriva was in constructing Opus Dei. And I also think that they are the metaphorical canaries in the coal mine, especially as so many of them continue to come forward and speak out. So, what are your thoughts on the whole assistant numerary situation and Escriva creating this thing inside this organization, especially with everything that is coming out now in Argentina and Ireland and elsewhere?
So Escriva, in sometimes kind of in the research and in the writing, I sometimes have to kind of shake myself because I occasionally kind of find myself, I'm not sure whether admiring is the right word, but in awe of some of the decisions that he makes. And you're like, he's clearly, so when he draws up this methodology for recruitment, he's a cult leader who's like decades ahead of his time.
Mm-hmm.
Some of it, it's quite impressive, some of the things. And I think he's clearly a very opportunistic person. He's very astute and opportunistic. So initially, when he first, you know, founds Opus Dei, he writes that never, ever will there be women in the organization. But then when he struggles to get any members, he then suddenly has this new epiphany or this new vision, you might say, to that actually women should be allowed. And so he kind of like he almost sees a business opportunity for opening up membership to women, and it works
Mm-hmm.
out very well. And I think coming back to the numerary servant question, you have to look at the timing of this. So he decides in the late 40s, and this is a time when Opus Dei is operating dozens of student residences around Spain and dozens of numerary residences as well. Um, the organization is spending quite a lot of money on domestic workers, on cooks and cleaners, to work in its residences to create this kind of rarefied atmosphere for the students and for the numeraries. And it's against that backdrop that he suddenly has this new revelation that maybe we should create this. I'm going to create this new underclass of membership that's just for domestic workers. And you're like, well, that's very convenient, isn't it? Because now what he effectively did was create a source of free labor for the organization. He saved Opus Dei an absolute fortune because for people that don't know, as a numerary, you're expected to give all of your earnings back to the movement. So if he was paying these women by recruiting them as numeraries or as numerary servants, he's then creating a requirement for them to hand back the wages that they've just been paid by Opus Dei. It's
They're not making any money
and
or
and and
saving any.
actually, and what happened in the end was Opus Dei just gave up paying them entirely because why go through this whole farce of paying you and you give it back to me? We might as well just stop paying you. Um, so I'm convinced that this was a very opportunistic business move. So for decades, this underclass of women, and it's only women. That's also an interesting thing for me because domestic workers include both men and women. Even if you think about the kind of traditional roles, of course, men can be cooks and cleaners or whatever, but even if you think of the kind of traditional kind of gender segregated roles, you would still have male drivers and male gardeners and male butlers. But for whatever reason, Escrivá decided not to extend the vacation of numerary assistant to men. It was specifically numerary servants, I should say. It was specifically for women.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and this goes on still to today in the 21st century.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Opus Dei is still recruiting girls, usually from underprivileged backgrounds in poor parts of the world to this vocation of numerically distant. And, coming back to kind of my discovery and the bank. So in the 1980s, the Banco Popular financed the construction of an enormous network of these schools where these girls were recruited. So what would happen was that numerals, often accompanied by priests, would be sent out into the countryside to poor villages. They would go door to door. They would, tell the parents that, hey, your daughters there are no chances of life around here. The schools are rubbish. There's no chance of an education. Send them back to the big city with us. Well, we're running this great school. We're going to teach the girls how to cook and,
Who wouldn't
the
leap on that opportunity?
absolutely. And so, the girls went willingly, the families sent their daughters willingly. And then the girls, once they were hundreds of miles away from home, we're talking like girls who are 12, 13 years old, you know, when the cut off from the network, the support network, they'd be then indoctrinated, coerced into joining Opus Dei, into to becoming Numeri servants. They're told this is your calling, this is what God wants. If you turn your back on this calling, then you'll go to hell, your families will go to hell. I mean, a young girl with no support network, how is she supposed to process that? And so, and this is still going on, and it's not just Argentina. Opus Dei has been very keen, I think, over the years, whenever abuse and scandal has arisen, they've been very keen to use the one bad apple kind of justification.
Yep.
That's absolutely not what's going on here. I know for a fact that these schools were set up all over the world. Just today, I saw on Opus Libros, which is a Spanish language site where
Yes.
former members share their stories. People talking about, a similar school in Mexico. I know there were schools in Peru, in the Philippines, in Nigeria, in Kenya. This is a global network of schools whose main purpose is to recruit underprivileged girls into this life of servitude. So what's happening in Argentina, where federal prosecutors have brought formal accusations against Opus Dei, accused Opus Dei of trafficking teenage girls into this life of servitude, where there's going to be a trial for four Opus Dei priests are going to be standing trial in the months, years ahead. It's just the tip of the iceberg. These cases, federal prosecutors are going to be looking at similar cases in other parts of the world. I know for a fact that prosecutors are looking at similar cases in other parts of the world, including Europe, other parts of the Americas. And for me, the one big missing piece in all of this is the Philippines. I'm convinced that the Philippines is the key to unlocking at least the kind of the modern part of this story. So yes, I mean, there's a lot more work to be done here, and I think this is the beginning of a huge abuse scandal that's going to be emerging in the years ahead.
I feel the same way. I've felt that way for a really, really long time. One of the thing that compelled me to continue talking about Opus Dei back in 2020 was not their conspiratorial things. It wasn't the concerning relationships with key political and economic players. It wasn't any of those things. That stuff is interesting and it's important and we have to talk about it, but it was quite literally finding out about the lives of assistant numeraries and what they are put through and the experiences that way too many people come out with, and they are all eerily similar. And at this point, I have heard from people literally all over the world: the United States, Canada, South America, the Philippines, Australia, England, Wales, Ireland, Scott, like Finland. We're talking all over the world. It is a global global issue. And I agree. I think there is this sort of sense that like a gathering of momentum, because it's all still very early days, and the narrative is still, I think, being put together, and all of the pieces haven't been found. But um, I am hopeful that what is happening in Argentina is the beginning of a trend. And we're going to see more of this type of thing going forward. I want nothing more than for these women to have their day of justice and to get the compensation that they deserve for the things that they were put through. And I think that your expose on that in Opus is a really important part of that. People have to understand this story, and they have to understand how it all works. And the assistant numerary piece of it is perhaps the most significant, in my opinion.
I mean, I should also say I can't take very much credit for this at all because the real kind of heroes or heroines in this are the 42 women in Argentina who have
Absolutely.
come forward. I mean, they aren't the first people to come forward. There have been other cases in the past, but they've been individuals. It's been easier for Opus Dei to kind of wash its hands or pay people off. But I think the critical thing here is that these women have come forward as a group, and that's given them confidence to tell their stories in public. It's also made it much harder for Opus Dei to just kind of explain itself away or explain this case away or to wash its hands or to pay them off. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think, we have to be thankful to these women for having being brave enough to come forward and call Opus Dei out. And I'm going to make a plug here as well for there's a fantastic documentary that's going to be coming out in the new year on HBO Max here in Europe. I believe it's going to be released across the world. It's called El Minuto Heroico, which is Spanish for the heroic minute. And it's a 4-part documentary where a number of numerary assistants from around the world tell their stories. Um, Full disclosure, I have nothing to do with the production. I mean, I was interviewed for the documentary. I haven't yet seen it, but I've been told by a number of numerary assistants that have seen a preview of it that it's really excellent. So people should certainly watch that. Um, and yes, I mean, the plight of these women, the numerary assistants, deserves all the attention it can get. But I'd also like to make the point as well that it's not this kind of abuse and manipulation isn't unique to the numerary assistants. The numerary population as well has suffered, in quite similar ways. I mean, they haven't been on their hands and knees scrubbing toilets and cooking, and they've in many ways they've enjoyed more freedoms than a lot of them have had jobs in the outside world and have had more kind of autonomy. Um, but they have also, led their lives at the whim of the organization. Like so many, and it's really quite sad, so many numeraries are enticed into the organization and told that Opus Dei will allow them to serve God through their everyday lives, and they can continue to be doctors or teachers or journalists or whatever they choose to be in life, only for the organization to suddenly change its mind 5 or 10 years on, and for the Opus Dei to request that these people leave their jobs and leave their families, their friends, their networks to go and start up some new apostolic activity for the organization in another part of the world, which, by the way, is completely unpaid. So it's the same dynamic of these people being expected to drop everything and go and serve Opus Dei completely unpaid in another part of the world, where their own personal and professional ambitions and desires are just completely irrelevant and
Mm-hmm.
just yeah just so and many of the numeraries, just like the numerary assistants, end up trapped inside the organization because they've been working unpaid for the organization for so many years. They have no savings to fall back on. They have no support network to fall back on. And so they, in effect, become trapped inside the organization, unable to leave because what do they go? What do they do? And so, yes, the memory system component is very important.
Hmm.
And what happened to those women is horrendous. But I would say that there were very similar dynamics as well for the male and female
Hmm.
Numeries, and even for the priests as well. Because again, the priests um, are basically pushed into the priesthood.
Hmm.
They're enticed into the movement, told that they can live their lives as lay people, and then one day they get a tap on the shoulder and they're told, "Hey, the prelate in Rome has decided that you're going to become a priest now, and you're basically expected to go along with the thing." So I think,
Yeah.
yeah, um, the abuse is widespread.
I'm really glad that you said that. And I think that you're absolutely correct, because I've spoken, and I'm sure you have as well. I've spoken to people who are former assistant numeraries, all the way up to just being a former cooperator or supernumerary, or having been raised in a family with parents who are supernumeraries. And across the board, although it may manifest in different ways, the perception that I have is that regardless of the class of the individual, the job that they had, their status within the organization, none of that really matters, because in the end, everyone is left with um, the same type of like trauma. Everyone is left with, and it manifests in different ways, but everybody that I have spoken to who's come out of this organization, interacting with them in any way, has some type of spiritual or emotional trauma that they have sustained as a result of their interactions with that. And I think that goes to show, like you said, yes, the assistant numerary situation is tragic and it needs attention, but they are not the only ones who are suffering. And I'm glad that you point that out, because I think the assistant numeraries are the most obvious example of how bad things are. There are so many other examples and types of abuse that are much harder to verbalize and articulate, and much harder to describe to someone. But that doesn't mean that it's any less real, and it doesn't mean that the people are suffering any less. So I am glad that you pointed that out. Um, Moving on again, I want to talk about your thoughts on Opus Dei's slow but inexorable march towards accumulating power and influence, especially in the Western world. In Opus, you wrote, in regard to the United States specifically, across the country, around 100 nonprofit organizations had been set up with hundreds of millions of dollars in assets, regional launch pads for the movement to recruit more souls to its mission, and soldiers in the fight to shape the public debate around abortion, same sex marriage, and prayers in schools. And since I became aware of Opus Dei, this is something that I've kind of watched unfold here in the US. But as Opus so eloquently portrays, this is not some new development in Opus Dei's behavior. So I'm curious, what do you make of that? And in your view, what does this kind of like slow but like steady march towards getting more power, more influence, what does that say about Opus Dei?
I think there's a it's a little bit more complicated. I think Opus Dei at the moment is in crisis. I think a lot of members are turning their backs on the organization. I think the organization is really kind of bleeding members at the moment, especially numerary members, and finding it harder to recruit. But at the same time, it's allying itself with, deep-pocketed donors who are kind of, so I think financially, I don't think Opus Dei is struggling, but I think in terms of ground troops, it's really going through a difficult time right now. I suspect what's going to happen is, I mean, we'll see what kind of reforms are forced on Opus Dei by the Pope if they ever happen. Um, but I think Opus Dei itself is also right now starting to rethink the way it does things, partly because it's got the resources financially, but it doesn't have the resources in terms of human bodies.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Traditionally it's relied on its numerary members to go out and recruit new members, and also it's relied on its numerary members to kind of to work the membership through the the regular kind of chats that these almost confessional like kind of spiritual guidance sessions and through the kind of evenings of recollection and the circles that it operates to kind of keep the network. But so I think with the numbers of Numeries falling, it's no longer going to be able to operate in that way, and so it's probably going to have to think of new ways of doing things.
Hmm.
But certainly the kind of financial firepower that it has and the alliances that it's built with deep-pocketed donors like the likes of Leonard Leo and Tim Bush or whatever, who are quite clearly very happy to bankroll the expansion of the Opus Dei school network in the United States. So this one of the big plans that Opus Dei has in the States is to expand its network of schools, which at present is, I think it's just 5 or 6 schools across the states. I think that they're aiming to open states in, I think they've identified 20 different states
Hmm.
where they could build schools. And if they build a boys' school and a girls' school in each, that would make for 40 new schools. And Leonard Leo is the face for this. If you go onto the websites, he's the guy there talking about why this is a great thing. I think that increasingly will become the new recruitment center for Opus Dei. So, Opus Dei schools have long been a place to recruit um, Numeries at a young age, but also a way to foster relationships with the local Catholic community and to recruit supernumeraries as well into the movement. So I think the school network will increasingly become an important place for a bit much like in Spain, a place for Opus Dei to recruit. And so yeah, so I think you've got this kind of slightly conflicting dynamics going on of the numery ranks really, really kind of bleeding members, a lot of numery saying enough's enough, we're out of here, morale being really low, but at the same time, um, so that I mean in itself could lead to the collapse of Opus Dei, but I think thanks to the financial support it's got, partly through these billionaire donors, that I think Opus Dei will adapt and live to fight
Hmm.
another day and adapt its recruitment methods to make the organization sustainable in a different way, I think.
Hmm. I think you're right. And I'm glad that you brought up the schools. This is so timely because the next thing that I wanted to talk about was Opus Dei's behavior towards children. One of the consistent narrative threads that you wove throughout Opus has been Opus Dei's relentless pursuit of underage children for recruitment. And I think it's telling that the organization continually chooses to do this, even though they keep doubling down and saying that they aren't. And it's almost as if Opus Dei realizes that it doesn't stand a chance if it can't reach vulnerable, easily manipulated people. And children are incredibly vulnerable. So I want to talk to you about this phenomenon that we see play out with between Opus Dei and these kids in these schools. Um, what do you make of this?
Well, I mean, the founder himself, even in the 30s, stipulated that he said he ordered that his his members shouldn't try to recruit anyone over the age of 25 because people over the age of 25 were, I can't remember the exact quote, but basically the implication was they asked too many questions.
They're
They were
too
kind
set
of
in their ways.
were too set in their ways. And you're like, that tells you something that, this is an organization that is going after people who are not going to ask too many questions, who are perhaps vulnerable, who are susceptible to being recruited into what in effect is a cult. So and that persists to this day. And so, the primary mission of the Opus Dei schools around the world is it's not educational, it's recruitment.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and this is kind of hidden in you know the way that Opus Dei likes they like to boast about and how in their schools they have this kind of mentoring program And I was talking to someone just last week, who was who attended one of the schools in DC. He was at the Heights, which is the
Mhm.
boys' school in DC, and he was saying that how Opus Dei like to boast about this mentoring program as a way of it's just a way of really it's enriching these young kids' lives. It's a way of ensuring that they get the best education and helping them along in their spiritual journey. And that's partly correct, I'm sure, but it's also a way for the Numeries, and the mentors are normally Numeries. It's a way for the Numeries to spot potential new recruits and then to groom them through the mentoring system. This is I'm the father. I've got three kids, who are you know of the age that they would be attending some of these Opus Dei schools. They're of that age, and my kids are, they're intelligent. They're astute, but they're also very naive. And it's very important in a school environment that there are checks and balances, and that um, kids aren't abused
Aren't
and
exploited.
yeah, and aren't exploited. I think it's important, and I think that if we were to peel back the veneer of these mentorships in the Opus Dei schools, we quite possibly would find something very unsettling. And I'm
Hmm.
not even sure the parents of some of these kids are aware of what's going on. I mean, there was a very good example, and I have this in the book. I mean, there was a school in Sydney, Australia,
Yes.
and we're talking when this is not a historical example. This happened just a few years ago, where some of the boys, we're talking boys who are like 12, 13 years old. Some of the boys were invited to what they called a homework club. So some of the boys were specially selected, I guess, by the Numeries who were doing mentorships or whatever. And they said, "Hey, why don't you come back to this homework club we're running back at the center, the Opus Dei residence?" And so they would be invited back there a couple of times a week. And one of the boys on one of these visits, they found a notebook with all of the boys' names noted down, and next to the names were listed the potential strengths and weaknesses that each of the boys might offer to Opus Dei as potential recruits. And you're like, these are boys, these are
They're
young, these are
children.
kids, they're children, and they've been invited back to the Opus Dei residence effectively on false pretenses. And the school has enabled this by allowing these numeraries in to prey on young kids. And, this is happening across the world. Opus Dei operates, I think it's 275 schools around the world, including the United States, including, I'm talking to you here from London. Not far from where I live here in South London, there are two Opus Dei schools. I'm sure the parents don't have a clue
Hmm.
about this kind of thing that's going on in Opus Dei schools around the world. And, they're recruiting the next generation of numeraries and supernumeraries, but specifically numeraries. I mean, at this age, what they're looking for is, they're looking for numerary members because in order to convince someone to sign up to this life of obedience and celibacy and poverty, you need to get to them from an early age. And that's precisely what the founder wrote back in the 1930s.
Yep. I believe you're referring to the piece that was done by ABC Four Corners. I believe Purity and Opus Dei. I have an entire episode where I went through, reacted to that, and that situation. That documentary is incredible. I've sent it to so many people because I think it does a excellent job of capturing in a much smaller scale the problem that is playing out in all of these schools. And I don't doubt for one moment that the things that are happening at Tangara and Redfield are the exact same things that are happening in every other school that's run by Opus Dei or has an Opus Dei presence, because they just don't like vary their playbook very much. City to city, country to country, continent to continent, the behavior just really does not change that much. And I find it so disgusting and disturbing, especially when you consider the fact that A few months ago, the Financial Times released an article talking about Opus Dei's targeting and recruitment of underage children. And there was a 15-year-old girl that said that she had been given a psilus by her mentor or whoever it was that had recruited her to wear on her body. A 15-year-old child should not be practicing corporal mortification. I think even the Catholic Church is very clear on that. And yet that is being encouraged in these Opus Dei schools. And the
And
impact, the effect, go
so,
ahead.
and Opus Dei refuses to even acknowledge this. I mean, so
Exactly.
they like to hide behind the fact these kind of they're very legalistic in the way that they kind of interpret things. So they're like, oh, well, nobody can become a member until they're 18. Well, that's true, but you're grooming these people for years before they reach the age of 18. The aim is that the day that they on their 18th birthday, that's what, that's when they kind of sign up. But it's,
Mm-hmm.
the process of convincing them to join is, yeah, takes years. Sorry, you're in the middle of saying something.
Well, and on top of that, Opus Dei says, well, we don't recruit underage children. That may have happened at some point back in the day, but we don't do that anymore. And that may be technically true, but they have this category called a junior candidate, which is a child who believes they have a vocation to Opus Dei. And isn't it so interesting that no one ever thinks they have a vocation to Opus Dei on their own? They always have to be told. But they have this category of junior candidate. And I would argue that it's just more obfuscation of reality. Opus Dei can say, we don't have underage children as members. We just have this junior candidate category for people who are interested. And that's like a nice thing to put out to the public, but that's not actually the lived reality for kids who end up being coerced into that.
Yeah. And it's yeah, I mean, you make a good point. I mean, I'd be very curious to ask Opus Dei how many how many kids or how many teenagers um, discover their vocation to join Opus Dei at Opus Dei schools, and how many discover their vocations who've kind of perhaps gone to different schools where they aren't kind of under the system of grooming and mentorship.
I'm sure it may happen. There may genuinely be people out there who think that this would be a great way to spend their lives. I don't doubt that for a minute because every single former member that I've met and talked to has been an incredibly intelligent, kind person, the kind of person who would be willing to dedicate years of their lives in service to something like Opus Dei, what Opus Dei espouses itself to be. Um, yeah, it's just, but it's, yeah, uh we could go in circles on that, but the child piece of it really that disturbs me so much. And with you saying like Opus Dei is pouring all of their energy now into these schools, they're planning on starting up these schools in these predetermined locations. I think that makes this piece of it all the more important. And it's important to highlight that as these articles have been released and written, and as people come forward and share about their experiences being recruited, Opus Dei continues to deny that this is a problem or even something that they need to spend any time contending with. So in addition to that, there's another issue that I'm really happy that you brought up. You reference in Opus the internal system of psychological controls that are reinforced by Opus Dei doctors prescribing psychopharmacological drugs. And this is an issue I would even go so far as to call it a crisis that I've actually spent quite a bit of time researching and learning about. And I've talked to so many former members who have stories about being prescribed pretty intense drugs when they didn't need them, and often as a reaction to a justified question or concerns being raised, and then suffering the consequences of these drugs. What is your perception of this issue from the research that you've done? And in your opinion, how rampant of a problem is it? Is that something you can even try to speak to?
I mean, I think it's it's I think the numerary ranks of Opus Dei are absolutely riddled with mental illness, partly because of the pressures and the manipulation and control of these, of every element of their lives. And I think this system of using Opus Dei doctors to prescribe drugs for these people is really quite common. I'm not sure whether it's in every country, but I mean certainly in Spain, it's yeah, extremely widespread. I've heard of it in the US as well, in various Latin American countries, and so yeah, I think this is one of the strands of the story that I would have liked to develop a little bit more for the book. Um, but I'm just one guy and there was a deadline to meet. And so I couldn't quite get there. But I think what I hope the book does is inspire other investigative journalists in other parts of the world to really dig into some of these things in more, because there are so many more stories to be uncovered and there are so many more scandals to surface. Um, and so, yes, I mean, I think, and that story would probably be top of my list now of exposing um, the use of prescription drugs to mask the what is a symptom of excessive control and abuse within the organization. I think um, these prescription drugs were used to just cover up a problem and the cause of which was, these hundreds and hundreds of pages of rules and regulations that were drawn up by Escrivá himself. Opus Dei created this mental illness, this epidemic of mental illness within the organization. And instead of addressing um, the root causes of what happened to many of these, to hundreds and if not thousands of memories, instead of addressing the root causes, the organization just turned to covering up the problem with prescription drugs. So many people I've spoken to who have come out of the organization and subsequently seen doctors, and the doctors have said, "What the hell? You were given this stuff. This is crazy. You should have been given this treatment, this therapy, and you should have been." And none of it was done. And the people I've spoken to are from different parts of the world, from the male branch, from the female branch, and for them all to have experienced this, I don't think can be coincidence. It's it's a huge story, I think, that needs to be investigated in more depth. And if I will do what I can, but there are many other people out there who are in a good position to do this as well. So I hope that this story is gets the kind of attention and reporting that it deserves.
I think it's pretty significant too. I picked up on the drug element of everything pretty early on, just from reading through people's testimonies on Odan and Opus Libris. It pops up being referenced pretty consistently, a little bit too consistently, even in the international complaint. They mentioned that even though, there have always been people with mental illnesses, and that perhaps you could say that there is a slightly higher percentage of people with mental illness who are attracted to religion, it's concerning the degree to which it's prevalent in Opus Dei, and that indicates something about the environment that's inculcated in Opus Dei. There's something unhealthy there. And I've started looking into it because I decided it had been just in the back of my head for a long time, and I decided to start digging into it because I had the time and it seemed like a good time to do it. And I should have known. I feel like this always happens. I should have known that I was going to find a whole lot more than I thought that I would. But I thought, it's the internet. How much information can really be out there about this? Surely Opus Dei has like done what they needed to. There's a lot out there. Actually, the episode that's going to be put up before our conversation today is just my like preliminary report on what I've found so far, and it's going to be like an hour long. So I found quite a bit, and I hope, like you say, other journalists in other parts of the world will start pulling at this thread too, because I think it's really, really important. And another aspect of this whole thing that's really important is you reference cases where Opus Dei went to what would consider pretty extreme measures to keep information contained and individuals suppressed, up to and including falsifying documents, falsifying people's signatures, and physically restricting the movement of individuals, confining them to Opus Dei centers under lock and key. And although I was familiar with Maria del Carmen Tapia's experience, I think I naively thought that her situation was like this insane one off or something. However, based on the things that you describe in Opus of people's experiences, I'm left with the impression that it's actually something Opus Dei has done several times. And I'm wondering, in your opinion, how common do you think this type of thing is?
I mean, it's kind of impossible to say, I think, but I think another kind of link to this, another element that I would really encourage journalists to delve into, and something I've been hearing quite a lot from former members, is the kind of mistreatment of elderly people within Opus Dei.
Mm.
So once numinaries and priests kind of reach their expiry date and they're no longer useful to the organization, I've heard of all kinds of horrendous treatment and abuse towards these people. And I guess that, I mean, I guess the example you're thinking of in the book is Luis, so that the chairman of the bank, when he gets old and sick, and his brother said that his brother Javier said that he was not allowed to see his brother, and his brother was basically locked up in the Opus Dei residence and not really allowed to have visitors, or not allowed to have certain visitors. Um, and yes, I think that that certainly merits more follow-up, I think. I've heard all kinds of horrendous stories.
There was also, I can't remember his name, but early on in the book, he had taken some money across
Oh
a
yeah.
border, and the authorities in that country ended up getting tipped off to the fact that he was there with this money and looking into him because they thought maybe he had ties to communism or something like that. And Opus Dei's reaction to that was honestly just insane. I mean, you can probably get into explaining the minutia of it better than I can, but I mean they basically forged his signature and then forced him to go away and rest, which from the way I read it meant that they basically locked him up.
Well, this guy's basically locked up in a mental asylum
Yes.
until they can figure out what to do with him. And eventually he comes to an agreement whereby he agrees to disappear to Argentina and start a new life. And that's what presumably happens, because his name just disappears off the face
Mm-hmm.
of the earth. And the book's been out for a good few weeks. Opus Dei has, if this guy was living a nice, good life in Spain or whatever, and this guy, Opus Dei's had an opportunity to explain precisely what happened to this guy and hasn't. So I don't know, but yeah, I mean, this guy just disappears off the face of the earth.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, no, that is a really
Putting people in mental asylums and that kind of thing, that really took my perception of what Opus Dei is willing to do to a whole new level. And I'm yeah, I if I haven't met too many people who say that that's happened to them. I don't think I've interacted with anyone but then again, I mean, we don't know how many people there could be. I mean, they could still be in there, you know?
possibly. Yeah.
So, at the end of the book, you wrote, almost a century from its founding, Opus Dei appears to have come full circle, fanning the culture wars and fueling deep divisions that risk ripping our society apart, while at the same time seeking to surreptitiously recruit tomorrow's leaders on university campuses, just as it did in 1930s and 1940s Spain. I think that this statement sums up Opus Dei's current socio-political situation pretty well. And the narrative arc of Opus left me with the impression that the organization is kind of at the beginning of this new chapter where they're poised to enjoy a little bit of a windfall that comes with status and the clout of the types of people that it appeals to, people like Leonard Leo and Kevin Roberts and Peter Thiel, Timothy Bush, and the whole gang. But what is your perspective and what are your thoughts about Opus Dei's future after having written this book?
Um, I would say the future very much hinges on the Pope and what he does. And as we were saying earlier, I think the Pope is in a bit of a difficult position. He doesn't want to create too many problems for the church. And so I think he's likely to probably kind of stage some kind of intervention, maybe put, like a friendly figure into head Opus Dei or to force reform or whatever. I doubt he's going to close it down. So I think probably, unfortunately, there's a future for Opus Dei. Whether or not it will ever fully reform, I'm so even if reform is forced on it, there will always be people who believe that the foundational documents written by Escrivá are the kind of material incarnation of this vision from God. And so they will be devoted to following, you know, every last word of what Escrivá wrote. So, yes, you can reform the organization, but there's always the risk that you'll have these kind of radical elements within the group that basically justify, anything goes. So, I'm not very hopeful that the group can be completely kind of cleansed of its sins. Yeah, for want of a better phrase,
Mhm.
but and I don't see Francis closing down the organization because I think that would open a whole can of worms and create all kinds of problems for the church, not least what to do with this guy who's a saint. Can you revoke his sainthood? Can you excommunicate a saint from the
Yeah.
Catholic Church? I don't think the Pope is going to want to go that far. So, yeah, I think the likely outcome here is, at least from a kind of church point of view, that it will be reformed, but not completely cleansed. But my hope is that, from a criminal prosecution point of view, that there may well be more progress. So, of course, we have this case in Argentina where four Opus Dei priests are set to stand trial for having participated in this system of human trafficking. Um, I think there could well be. I know that there are moves in other parts of the world to bring similar cases. I've spoken with prosecutors myself, and I believe some of them may well come to fruition. We will see. But I think that there is potential for, yeah, criminal proceedings against senior figures within Opus Dei, which could in itself kind of lead to the downfall of the organization. Something that maybe the church is not willing to do, but could almost be forced on it from the outside. And of course, you know, there's all of the coverage. You know, one thing one of my central kind of one of my goals with writing the book was just to shed light on these abuses and hopefully, you know, public awareness around what Opus Dei really is will public education is key. Stopping this cycle of the next generation being recruited into Opus Dei is critical. And if my book achieves nothing else, the fact that when you Google Opus Dei, that my book and all of these abuses come to light for anyone, that's probably the biggest legacy I think of this project. But there are so many other people out there now who are doing important work, including yourself. People like Paolo Abistagnino in Argentina, who's exposed many of the Numeri assistant cases, Antonia Cundy at the Financial Times here in London. Um, there are journalists all over, and Monica Terribas, who's the woman behind this new documentary that's coming out in the new year. There's a whole army of people now who are dedicated to exposing these abuses. And so, my hope is that even if the church can't sort out these clear abuses inside the Catholic Church institution, then hopefully either criminal prosecutors or the media will at least help to expose what's really going on.
Mhm. And there's the court of public opinion as well, which is why I think the education piece of it is so incredibly important and why your book is so critical. And I thank you so much for taking the time to research it and write it. I know writing is not writing a whole book is a tall order, and one about such a complex and controversial topic. The fact that you took that on is admirable, and I know I'm probably don't need to tell you this. You've been hearing it from plenty of former members, but I think that your work is going to have such a positive impact on people's lives, former members, and then people who are spared from making the mistake of committing to this thing, because maybe they pick up your book and they don't believe everything that's in it, but it plants that seed of doubt, and maybe they'll start asking some other questions, and they'll be spared. So I know we're starting to get to the end here, and I don't want to keep you longer than you want to be here, but I was wondering if you would be interested in answering any questions from some anonymous former members.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be very much open to that. Yeah.
Okay, so I posted on the r/Opus Dei exposed Reddit community, which for anyone who doesn't know is a anonymous community on Reddit for former members, and then anyone trying to learn more information or provide support to a former member can basically have community talk to each other, exchange resources, and make a little bit of an archive too of everything that has happened in Opus Dei. And it's been an incredible resource for me as a journalist. And I know you mentioned it in your book as well. I'm so incredibly grateful for all of these people who have been brave enough to, even if it's anonymous, to speak out what happened to them, to share their experiences. So because your book touches on so much of that, I wanted to give anyone in that community an opportunity to ask you some questions. And I have a few here we can just go through.
Well, just before you do that as well, I also want to, so the Reddit community is fantastic and has been a critical resource for me. I also want to make a plug for the Spanish language
Yes.
community, which is called Opus Libros. So the site is opuslibros.org, and there's a wealth of material there as well for anyone that speaks Spanish. Or you know what, these days most browsers you can quite quickly click and you'll get a decent translation. So yes, but yeah, Pharaoh, your question, I just wanted to make sure that Opus Libros gets a shout out as well.
Yes, absolutely. And I'll have all of those communities and then any references and also a link to your book for anyone who would like to buy it down in the description of this video as well. But so here are some questions. Somebody asked, and you kind of spoke to this a little bit earlier, but maybe you can expound a bit more. Were there any narrative threads you wanted to include but couldn't, and why?
Yes, I mean, so we touched on a few of them. I mean, I would have loved to get to the bottom of the whole Roberto Calvi case. So
Yes.
intriguing.
Yes.
Maybe one day the Vatican will open its archives and we will get to know
We can
what
dream.
happened there. But I mean, that would have been amazing. But I never got to the bottom of that. Another thing somebody told me, somebody who knew Luis Valls Taberner extremely well, kind of made this kind of quite flippant comment one day when I interviewed him, and he said that "Did you know that after Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, Luis Valls Taberner was perhaps made the one of the largest contributions to the downfall of communism and the Soviet bloc?" And I was like, what? And he wouldn't go any further, but he was like, trust me on this. I know this. And I think I think the implication was, I think what he was hinting at, and I never was able to prove this, but I think what he was hinting at was that Luis and Opus Dei more generally were funneling money into places like Poland when they were behind the Iron Curtain, and were really helping to kind of create dissent. I'm not sure is the right word, but they were supporting some of the dissenting voices behind the Iron Curtain. I would have loved to dig more into that. And you know what? Maybe it's complete nonsense, but this guy was extremely close to Lewis and knew him extremely well and was in a position to know about this kind of stuff. And so unfortunately, he wouldn't share very much more. But the other, I mean, the other strand I would have loved to, and I would still love to delve into is the Philippines and the network of hospitality schools in the Philippines. I'm convinced that there's a huge story to be told there. I think the Philippines has, in recent years, become the primary recruitment ground for Nunnery assistants.
Mm.
It's quite surprising that you don't really see many Nunnery assistants come forward on the Reddit forum or on the Opus Libris forum from the Philippines, and I think
It is small.
there's possibly language issues there and things, but yeah,
Hmm.
I think there's potentially a huge story to be uncovered there. I've heard tidbits of what could be a huge story, and yeah, I'll do my best to delve into that. But yeah, I think without being on the ground and without speaking the language, it's difficult. So
It is
hopefully, there's a
incredibly, yeah.
female journalist out there who might be willing to take on that mantle.
I think that there's something interesting going on in the Philippines as well. I've thought that for a really long time. I've spoken to one or two people who claim to come from that part of the world. Obviously, this all carries out over the internet, so I have no way to verify anyone's claims. Really, I have to take their word for it. But I have heard stories from like one or two people about Opus Dei in the Philippines. And the Philippines, just in general, has a very interesting relationship with Catholicism specifically, and the history of that religion in that country is very complicated. So I think there's something there too. I've had the same thought. I don't know precisely what it is, but again, I would bet dollars to donuts, an expression that we have, that you in the near not too distant future we're going to see some stuff start to come out, because I just again I feel like the snowball is already rolling down the hill. It's getting bigger as we speak.
Yeah.
Somebody else asked, there is some controversy over what Opus Dei's current membership numbers are, with some former members stating that the number touted by Opus Dei is an exaggeration. After your research, do you have any sense of whether or not Opus Dei is growing or diminishing in terms of the number of people involved? You kind of spoke to this when we were talking about them establishing their schools and everything, but this is a conversation that they have often in the Reddit community about whether or not Opus Dei is growing or shrinking.
I mean, the simple answer is we don't know.
We don't know. It's
They
hard to
probably
tell.
know, but I mean, they know for certain, but we don't know. I mean, that so Opus Dei gives a number every year officially to the Vatican, and each year it goes up, and kind of curiously, they're getting very close to 100,000 members,
Mm-hmm.
actually. And I suspect that as we approach the 100th anniversary of Opus Dei in 1928, and that perhaps will, sorry, in 2028, they will miraculously hit the
Be a
100,000.
nice round number for them, yes.
Exactly. But I don't believe those figures. And in fact, in the book, I think I offer a couple of examples where they blatantly lied about the membership figures. So, I mean, my sense, and it's just a sense because I don't have any hard figures, is that the numeri ranks are diminishing quite quickly,
Mm.
but that the supernumerary ranks are in some parts of the world growing. I think in the US they're growing. I think in parts of Latin America they're growing. And so um, I think whether you would only need small percentage growth in supernumeraries because it's such a large component to
Hmm.
offset even a large decrease in the numerary. So I think it's possible that the numbers are increasing, but I think certainly the numerary ranks are depleting quite quickly, and that's a big problem for Opus Dei because the numeraries are critical to the way that it operates for the recruitment and to kind of maintaining the network. And so yeah, um, yeah, that's my sense of how things are.
Hmm. The asker of this question acknowledges that you may not be able to give a detailed answer, but they were curious about how you were able to get some of your inside information about what life as a numerary was like. Were current members totally upfront with you? And were you always planning on seeking out the perspective of former members, or was that something that became apparent that you should do later on?
No, I mean, throughout I've been talking to current and former members.
Hmm.
Um, Current members, there are many lovely people and many devout Christians who, I sometimes struggle to get my head around this because, part of me is part of me feels quite sorry for them that they're stuck inside of this organization, but then maybe some of them are happy. Maybe I don't know. So it's a difficult kind of thing to grapple with. But yeah, I mean, I spent a lot of time. I spent 5 years on this book, and I spent a lot of time with current members. And yes, I mean, many of them were very generous with me and shared, you know, huge amounts of time with me and listened to my questions, my sometimes impertinent questions about, prodding about their lives. And I think on the whole, most of them answered me truthfully. But I also spoke to former members who maybe gave me a more nuanced understanding of life inside.
Mhm.
But also I was aided by, there's this treasure trove of internal documents that were secreted out of the organization. And inside there, you get to see, the rules and regulations of life inside of Opus Dei. So that was also a major help in terms of piecing together daily life and how things really worked. So it was a
Mhm.
combination of all three of like speaking to current members, former members, and then these internal documents. Yeah, trying to piece together the three things.
Somebody else asked, in your opinion, why is Opus Dei interested in politics and why does it seem to attract so many political people?
I mean, it's not that it seems to attract; it goes after these people, right? So I mean, so right from the beginning, Escrivá was obsessed with um, influencing society. I mean, he was a reactionary figure. He was horrified at some of the advances in the early 30s for, people turning their backs on the church, workers rising up, demanding rights, the state taking over public education rather than it being in the hands of the church. And so I think he quite quickly realized that in order to push back on that, you needed to have influence. And so right from the start, he very in a very determined way, he went after people in positions of power, and that persists to this day. So if it does attract, if Opus Dei does count a large number of politicians in its ranks, that's because they've been targeted by Opus Dei because it wants to have that kind of influence within the kind of Opus Dei network.
Mm-hmm. I think when you look at the way that Escriva designed Opus Dei, especially once he hammered out all of the finer details about the different membership categories and everything, he basically created a structure that is set up like a fork with prongs to get into every single level of society. And that was like very, very intentional. And you can see that represented in the things that he wrote. You provided examples of that in your book and then also in the like behavior of the organization today. Since Opus was released and you've begun to receive feedback on your work, has there been something that you weren't expecting or that surprised you about people's reactions to the book?
I mean, one thing is something I shared earlier of this, this priest from inside of Opus Dei reaching out and telling me what a great job I'd done, and you're like, just a minute, you're still inside the organization, right? And that was surprising. I mean, almost every day I get a message from someone, sometimes inside the organization, more frequently people who've left the organization who want to share their stories, and I try to speak to all of them because I recognize that um, it's difficult sometimes to share these things. And I think a lot of these people, want to thank me for, in some ways, having validated their experience. For them to read now in a book about things that happen to them and for having lived through the system, I think is quite an important part of processing what's happened to them. So I try to speak to all of them. Um, so yeah, I mean it's been really quite validating as well for me to have these people, so many people come and say, look, you thank you for writing this, and you did a great job of um of getting through. I mean, the book's not perfect. I mean, if I had more time, or if I could do another draft of it, there are things I would change, things I would add, things I would delve deeper into. Um, but it is what it is. I had to stop at some point, and but yeah, it's been
I
generally positive.
understand. I can understand that feeling. There was probably a moment when you submitted your final draft, or, right before the book was set to come out, where it was like you were about to tip over the edge of a cliff. And it's like, you don't know what's on the other side. You had to let go of this project and like send it out into the ether, whatever will be, will be. And you're just like holding on and hoping for the best. But I think that the book was incredible. I am so happy to see so many people sharing the same thought, that they've enjoyed it and enjoyed reading it. And again, I just want to say, for anyone listening, if you haven't purchased this book yet, there is a link down in the description. But if you don't want to buy it, that's okay. Don't forget about your public library and the interlibrary loan program. That's an awesome way to get a book if you don't want to or have the funds to purchase it. Before I let you go today, is there anything that you would like to plug, and where can people learn more about your work and keep up with you?
Um, Not really. You can find me on X. I'm at Gareth_Gore. I've recently also started up on Blue Sky. I'm at Gareth Gore, I think, although it's also new that but
Okay.
yeah, you should be able to find me. But no, I mean, I when I finished writing the story, it's so all-consuming. You've kind of fallen down the rabbit hole as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so all-consuming and exhausting and draining. And I feel bad for saying that because I haven't lived through these terrible experiences. But listening to all of this and just engaging with this organization is quite draining. And
It's grim.
I was ready to move on, and I was hoping to move on completely, but um, it's impossible to escape the rabbit hole, and I keep getting dragged back in, partly by all of these wonderful people who've reached out to me and shared their stories. And there are now so many leads for me to follow and strands. So maybe I'm not over. I don't think I'll be writing another book about Opus Dei, but there are little projects that I can't really talk about right now, but which I might be able to talk about in a few months, where I think hopefully we'll be able to give voice to more of these stories in the months and years ahead. Yeah, there's certainly potential for some quite exciting stuff. So we will see.
Well,
Watch this space.
I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful for what the future holds, and I'm looking forward to following your work going forward, regardless of whether or not it's focusing on Opus Dei or something completely different. I feel like since I started doing this entire deep dive project, I've gotten the opportunity to connect with some really incredible journalists, and you being a perfect example. And you guys are such incredible people for me to look up to. You work so hard, you do your due diligence, cite your sources, all of the things that I am always harping on, I care about so much. So thank you so much for talking with me today, for sharing your thoughts about your book. I feel like this is going to be a conversation that people are going to be really interested in hearing. I had a lot of people asking if I was going to have you on. So I was like, I just need to ask. And maybe he'll come on. Maybe he'll say yes and he'll take pity on me and come on. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
All right. I hope that you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing if you haven't already. If you haven't read Opus yet, please find a copy and read it. I've left a link down below where you can purchase it on Amazon, but like I said earlier, don't forget about your local library. Details to connect with me via social media and follow and support my work are in the description of this video. This is a totally independent venture, so your support and feedback are greatly appreciated. This month's supporters are listed here on the screen. Thank you so much, guys, for all of the cups of coffee. You have no idea how much it helps. Thank you for placing so much value on the work that I am doing. That is all I have for today, but I am looking forward to hearing your thoughts about today's conversation and the book down in the comments below. And I am looking forward to sharing the next deep dive with you all very, very soon. In the meantime, stay blessed, and remember, nolite te bastardes carborundorum. Don't let the bastards drag you down.